We think Dostoevsky was always a beacon of Russian literature, but true recognition came to him nearly a century late, even though his literary career started off promisingly. Dostoevsky's first novel, Poor Folk, was published in 1846, and for the young author, just 25 years old at the time, it was an overwhelming success. Dostoevsky wrote that he was suddenly famous, and everyone was talking about him. But everyone meant the literary salon goers, just a small circle of a few dozen people. To give you some context, literary magazines in the mid-19th century had circulations ranging from 600 to 6,000 copies. Now let's add more context. In 1840, St. Petersburg had a population of 470,000 people, and Moscow had 350,000 people. Literacy rates across Russia ranged from 2 to 8% depending on the region. So, in reality, not everyone was interested in Dostoevsky. Most people were far more interested in gypsy songs and biographies of saints. But as people tend to do, then and now, they lived in their own informational bubbles and projected their impressions onto the entire world. At the literary gatherings Dostoevsky attended, participants read forbidden articles and discussed potential reforms for Russia. At that time, most of the country's population were serfs, essentially property, bought and sold like livestock. Just like in America, this outraged many educated people. One writer suggested setting up an underground printing press to produce pamphlets, and that was enough for the entire group to be arrested, sentenced to death, and then commuted to forced labor. These people had not killed or stolen from anyone. They had no money, no weapons, no organization capable of a coup. They hadn't even come near the Tsar's palace. They posed no real threat. The cruelty and senselessness of such punishments back then and even today can be explained quite simply. Officials in charge of political cases could expect rewards and promotions if they harshly punish rebels. It was a way to prove loyalty to their superiors and advance their own careers. In 1849, at age 28, Dostoevsky was sent to Siberia. He returned to St. Petersburg 10 years later and wrote about his experiences in the House of the Dead. People in the Russian mainland often saw the terrifying, endless columns of prisoners being marched to Siberia, but few knew what really happened there. Dostoevsky had visited hell and come back alive, and this sparked not only sympathy, but intense curiosity. That's how Dostoevsky became a literary celebrity. Dostoevsky lived off his writing, and he had significant expenses. First, he had a wife and children to support. He had 4 kids, but 2 died, a sadly common story. And second, Dostoevsky suffered from epilepsy and tuberculosis, the defining urban illness of the 19th century. Treating these conditions meant constant trips to German resorts. There was no other way to ease his suffering. Third, Dostoevsky had a gambling habit and could easily lose not only all his earnings, but even his pocket watch. To keep afloat financially, he had to sign contracts with literary magazines that serialized his novels, publishing them in parts over a year or so. If you ever found the plots of Dostoevsky's novels a bit chaotic, now you know why. He did not submit the whole manuscript at once. He sent it chapter by chapter. Sometimes he'd send the beginning to the publishers without knowing himself what would come next. He had to piece the plot together as he went along. Do you think his works were immediately accepted for publication? Not at all. Dostoevsky first had to get his theme approved by the editor. He didn't have much creative freedom. He initially wanted to write about a strong personality, but that idea was rejected. The editors also did not like his concept for The Drunkards, a novel about the alcoholics of St. Petersburg. Back then, just as today, it was considered not the right format. He desperately needed money. But the publishers only became interested in a new novel when he pitched a psychological account of a crime. You know what came of it? Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky simply could not afford to write something that wouldn't sell. So if the publisher Katkov hadn't given Dostoevsky an advance of 300 rubles, we'd never had met Raskolnikov. What drew readers to Dostoevsky's work? He built his stories not on what happened to his characters, but on their inner experiences and reflections. Some people live their lives in the external world, while for others, the most important events happen inside their minds. Dostoevsky was one of the latter, and he spoke to like-minded readers in the language they understood. This was how the psychological novel was born. Moreover, Dostoevsky captured a major trend of his time. The second half of the 19th century was an era of rapid urbanization. Millions of people flocked to the cities, trying to adapt to conditions completely different from village life. This gave rise to crime, poverty, and other social issues affecting both former peasants and landless nobles who had lost their means of living. Readers in cozy drawing rooms had no idea what was happening in the back alleys, taverns, and gloomy apartment buildings where the city poor lived. But they wanted to know, especially since the idea that a respectable person should serve not oneself, not feudal lord, but the people had firmly taken root in the second half of the 19th century. To do that, it was necessary to understand how the people lived and what they thought. Dostoevsky's novels can be compared to the work of American photojournalist Jacob Riis, who in 1890 shocked the public by revealing how the other half of New York lived. He was the first to use flash photography for reportage, literally illuminating the city's dark corners. And what he found there was terrifying. Dostoevsky showed not only the horrors of urban poverty, but also helped his readers formulate their own beliefs and answer important questions. What are my values? What do I believe in? What are good and evil for me personally and for society? During his lifetime, Dostoevsky was famous in a relatively small circle. Many people attended his funeral, but let's remember the context. 20,000 people attended the funeral of Matrona the Barefooted Fool. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Dostoevsky was seen as just a commercially successful writer, with his own fan base among the educated. But he was gradually forgotten. In the early years of Soviet rule, Dostoevsky was only remembered by literary scholars. He had a reputation as a reactionary who opposed revolutionary ideas. As a result, he was excluded from the pantheon of great Russian writers until the late 1960s. His fame came back thanks to translations into German and later other European languages. It was only when prominent foreign authors began to talk about the importance of Dostoevsky that Soviet leaders took notice. This happened during the heat of the Cold War. a time when the USSR needed symbols to clearly show what Soviet people could be proud of. In the 1960s, the USSR faced an unsolvable contradiction. Half a century had passed since the Bolshevik Revolution, but prosperity was nowhere to be found. Clever officials found a solution. They declared that the West did everything for money, while in the USSR everything was done for great ideals and achievements. So national symbols became grand sports, classical ballet, space exploration, and great writers. These symbols represented depth, scale, and greatness, in contrast to the lowly culture of the West. What they conveniently left out was that Soviet sports, ballet, and space exploration became great only because enormous resources were poured into them. The same applied to the promotion of the great dead writers. Their works were published in massive print runs, translated into foreign languages, and support was given to those studying Russian culture, especially in the USSR's allied countries. All of this was done at the state's expense, without regard to supply and demand. This is how Dostoevsky became a luminary of Russian literature.